Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. An awesome auditorium of audacity and alliteration. On this January 31st day, I'm your host, DJ BJ Turnov for Stitcher and Z Talk Radio. Although our show is obviously the best program on TV, radio, anywhere, on any week. Officially, though, History Channel's Curse of Oak Island was the week's most watched broadcast in the United States, which means the show and the mysteries of Oak Island has become a pop culture phenomenon, not just with the weirdos like us over here. In celebration of this milestone, longtime Rolling Stone journalist and author Randall Sullivan, who has appeared on the History Channel show, is coming by our little program to converse about his book of a similar name, The Curse of Oak Island, the story of the world's longest treasure hunt. We're going to talk about Oak Island's rich and strange history and the treasure hunters who have driven themselves to financial ruin, psychotic breakdowns, and even death in search of it. We'll start from the beginning in 1795 with the teenager who discovered a mysterious circular depression in the ground on the Nova Scotia island. And then we'll take you all the way up to the present day with the Michigan brothers Marty and Rick Legina, and all the weird and crazy, perplexing discoveries in between. Randall Sullivan and I are going to take our own stab and provide our theories for what's hidden in the infamous Money Pit and the rest of the Oak Island. Help us solve this mystery when The Mind's Eye returns in a moment on Stitcher and Z Talk Radio. The Mind's Eye is back, and we're here represented in Stitcher and Z Talk Radio. Before Randall Sullivan and I take you on a quest to Oak Island, let's take a digital quest to find and save the world's most famous shipwreck, the 1628 story of the Vasa, the greatest warship to never go to war. And we'll take another trek to find out why a Visigothic treasure was buried in a grave. The answer awaits you now at the Mind's Eye Facebook and Twitter. Our account is at Mind's Eye Show for both, at Mind's Eye Show, or just go to our website where you can get the links for everything, themindseyemedia.com, which is now also including a recent blog in celebration and commemoration of Martin Luther King Day called Don't Call It a Theory, The Conspiracy to Kill Martin Luther King Jr. Read it now, themindseyemedia.com. While you're there, you can get more info on Randall Sullivan, our guest who's joining us momentarily. He's from History Channel's television show, The Curse of Oak Island. We're talking about the mysteries that have enthralled generations of treasure hunters. Stay tuned. The Mind's Eye returns shortly on Stitcher and Z Talk Radio. Rare chance for us here at the Mind's Eye to speak with a big contributor of one of our all-time favorite magazines, Rolling Stones. We welcome now Randall Sullivan to the Mind's Eye. Mr. Sullivan, big thanks for giving us some of your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
Your book, The Curse of Oak Island, the story of the world's longest treasure hunt. From what I'm told, it's the perfect companion piece to the hit reality show of the same name. Randall, just for sake of disclosure, don't hate me, but I've actually never seen the show. But I did find your book to be incredibly well researched and really just a captivating historical read from start to finish. So kudos on that front. And I gave a quick intro about the island before, but you can obviously articulate a bit more about what we're dealing with here. Just give a quick synopsis of Oak Island and for the unfamiliar.
Essence of Oak Island is mystery. Something extraordinary happened there a long time ago, and no one has been able to figure out exactly what it was. The early searchers, the people who first discovered the works there, assumed they were looking for buried treasure, and most of the people who've searched on Oak Island believe that, although their ideas about what that treasure might be have changed. But the one irreducible fact is that a fantastic work has been done on Oak Island. Over what period of time, we don't know, but at least more than 220 years ago. Maybe it was in multiple stages, maybe it was at one time. But whatever it was, one has to assume there was a fantastic purpose, because there's no other explanation for what was done there.
And the origin of the book started with your Rolling Stones article. It's a bit of a two-parter. Were you aware of Oak Island before the assignment was given to you, and what really kept your interest all those years later on, almost 2 decades later, to want to write a book?
Well, before I began working on the Rolling Stone article, honestly, I hadn't heard of not until shortly before Oak Island. I was talking to the editors there about doing some sort of histories, mysteries, sort of a series, or at least getting for actually the sister magazine, Men's Journal, at the time. And so I was doing after a sketchy amount of original research, I discovered Oak Island and thought, what an incredible story is this? Could this possibly be real? So then I made my way to Nova Scotia, and the big challenge then was just to get on the island, because no one had been allowed on in some time. The two men who really controlled access to the island, what was really just one man, Dan Blankenship, who he and his wife were the only people living on the island at the time, had chained off the causeway and wouldn't let anybody set foot on the island. But I was able to get him on the phone and get him to meet me for a drink, and that led to him telling me, okay, come over and I'll spend an hour with you and see if I think you're worth any more of my time. I ended up staying for several days, and he really gave me free run of the island and opened up his vast trove of both the history that historical research he'd done and the actual physical discoveries he'd made. And then there was another man who had a house on the island. He was there not very much, but he owned a small part of the island. And it was a surveyor named Fred Nolan, who had really gone over virtually every inch of Oak Island and laid it out in charts and graphs, and had made some astounding connections that didn't sound like they could possibly be real. But by the time I left, I was convinced they were. So I had this, I thought, great article, and certainly was received that way. And but I sort of let it go, except in the back of my mind. And I just happened to be, I was doing my own television show for a while, and one of the people they brought in as a sparring partner was this professional skeptic named Joe Nickel, who you may have encountered yourself. And he had written something about Oak Island. We had a brief discussion of it, and he was challenging some of the what he called the foundational myths of Oak Island. And I didn't think that I had quite enough knowledge or command of the facts to debate him to my satisfaction. So that kind of piqued my interest. And then out of nowhere, the people who did the show called me and asked if I would join the cast for a few episodes. And the idea was, well, I'd written this famous article about Oak Island, and I was going to come back and research a book. I told my publisher, who said, well, then you better write a book, right? So, and then the people who own the History Channel decided this needed to be the official book of the show, and one thing led to another.
And all of us really for the better, because it is such a wonderful historical account of the island and obviously what's going on right now in contemporary times. And you mentioned Blankenship and Nolan, and those two obviously loom large over the story. But I want to come back to them in a little bit, kind of just start a little bit from the beginning here, just to separate a little bit truth from fiction. What is factually known about the island leading up to the initial discovery?
Well, up to the time of the initial discovery, virtually nothing, other than that it was covered with oaks, which made it really stand out, oak trees, which made it stand out in Mahone Bay is, got dozens and dozens of islands, but oak, and there may or may not have been an occasional oak tree on another island, but this was the only one that was literally covered with oak trees. The original surveyors and explorers, found that curious, and the early settlers thought, well, what a great resource! It's the one source of hardwood in that area, because it was mostly spruce and pine, but some local legends, I guess, had grown up. I mean, I don't know how much of that is apocryphal or not, but all that we know for sure is that, and I didn't even know that for sure, I must say, until I started researching the book and really sort of tested the foundational myths, as Joe called them, and found out that they held up under scrutiny. I mean, the available facts support the story almost completely. but it was, these three young men, teenagers, who discovered this circular depression. I think initially it was because they saw that there were these young oak trees growing amid the stumps of old oak trees, and they thought, well, who could have done that? Because they were the first people doing any work or exploring on the island. And there were many stories of pirate treasure in that time. Mahone Bay and the whole North Atlantic coast was a pirate haven, but Mahone Bay was in particular because the pirates used the city at the entrance to Mahone Bay, Le Havre, as a base. Actually, they were allowed to use as a base by the French government. So there were all these myths and stories. And they weren't entirely mythological. There have been a number of pirate treasures discovered in that area. So they were convinced it was Captain Kidd's treasure because that was the prevailing story at the time. So they began to dig, and they immediately found that this was something, because just below the ground, about 2 feet down, there was a patio of flagstones that clearly had been placed there. They pulled that off and began to dig, and the soil was very loose. But this is really hard clay ground up there, and the entire circumference of this pit, what became the pit, was hard clay, but the inside was soft. Clearly had been dug previously. So they dug down 10 feet, struck wood, thought they'd hit a treasure chest, Captain Kidd's treasure chest, but it turned out to be a platform of logs that were embedded in the sides of into the walls of this pit and cylinder. It was really perfectly cylindrical, which is interesting too. But so they tore those out, dug down another 10 feet, struck wood again, and discovered that also was a platform of logs. And whether they were exactly 10 feet down and the next was exactly 10, that's the stories that they told later. No one took measurements. There was no one was fact checking it in those days. But anyway, they looked up 20 feet down and saw these walls of clay towering above them, and knew that they could be buried alive if there was any sort of a breakdown of the earth. They got wet, whatever. So they climbed out, covered it up, and went looking for someone who would, finance a more elaborate search. And it took several years, but a true expedition was mounted, and a group of men with money and supplies and equipment sailed around the Bay of Fundy. It was a 200 and some mile trip in those days, and landed at Oak Island, and this time really performed a major excavation with wooden cribbing to prevent a collapse. And they'd obviously been shown enough. The men who financed this, one who convinced the others had actually seen the pit, recognized something extraordinary had happened here, and that's why they were willing to put their money in. Anyway, they went down to 30 feet and found another platform of logs, and again at 40 feet, again at 50 feet, again at 60 feet, again at 70 feet and 80 feet, and at 90 feet. They found yet another platform of logs, but this one had a large stone laying in the center of it. They turned it over, and there was either carving or scratching of either figures or letters and figures, but something written on it. They couldn't decipher it. They took the stone out, but somehow they triggered some sort of a water trap. And by the next morning, the pit was full of water to the 65-foot level, and that flood system was the essential thing that frustrated treasure hunters for the next 150 years.
And there's the allegation that McGinnis and co. actually did find the treasure, and that just really the rest of the story has been concocted to hide that. And that might explain the reason why nobody's found anything, but you really found evidence that you didn't find any evidence of great fraud.
Well, it just doesn't make sense, because those young men themselves and then their generations of their families continued to search there. So I don't think they would have dedicated their lives, their fortunes, their children's lives to assert that they'd already found what it was they were looking for.
Let's move it along a little bit. Over the next century, collectively speaking, from the excavations, pretty much proved that there was a lot of man-made works on the island. Talk about some of the discoveries that confirm that, no, this is legit and something's down there.
Yeah, I mean, other than the pit itself, it was the effort of a exploration company that was formed in the middle of the 19th century that they decided to try to, since every effort to try to stop, to get deeper into the money pit by digging other tunnels, diverting water, whatever. They hadn't been able to stop the flooding, so they decided to try to trace it to its source. They went to a place called Smith's Cove that was the most obvious to them source of the water flowing in. And what they found there was absolutely extraordinary. It was basically a man-made beach. All of the rock on the beach had been lifted off. The sand had been removed as well. And this thick mat of seaweed and coconut husks had been created like a giant sponge. And then underneath that, these rock drains, very well made, hand-fitted rock drains had been made, clearly to create some sort of something to conduct water for some reason. And they were never able to completely figure it out, but what they uncovered suggested, it was an effort that would have taken a dozen men, 6 months to do, working every day. It was there were at least 100,000 pounds of sand that had been removed, and so it was a fantastic thing that puzzled just added to the puzzlement of Oak Island. There seemed to be the remains of a coffered dam, which someone had built to hold back the ocean at some point in the bay, and other works. So, again, working on this kind of a scale, what could it possibly be? Who would do this for any reason other than to conceal, in their minds, some incredible fortune?
Let's talk about a little bit of the Dan Blankenship's discoveries with the Becker drill. I mean, that was such a huge part of it. Talk about that significance in drilling there.
Yeah, well, I mean, Dan was, he's very mechanically minded, and he was convinced that he could dig somewhere and find I think they were trying to locate the flood system itself, the flood tunnel. But anyway, one of their boreholes was struck. It was the one other place on the island besides the money pit where fresh water and salt water were intermingling. And it was flowing in a way that suggested that it could be connected to the money pit. But when they drilled, the Becker drilling got down into it, but it was they used basically an air pressure system to force up what was ever down there. And they brought up, metal that was clearly hand-worked and centuries old, among many other things, various artifacts or pieces of things. Now, there's also Dan had claims about what he actually saw when they sent a camera down. Those are disputed, and I don't even though I have great respect for Dan, I don't necessarily take all of that at face value. But even just what they brought up, is inexplicable. There were tools and pieces of primitive equipment that were at like 150 feet below ground. Somebody was working down there, digging down there at least 220 years ago. And again, I mean, it's all theory as to why. Conjecture, sometimes educated conjecture, but there are such a proliferation of theories that's one of the. It's hard to sort that part out, but it was just further evidence that something really had happened there, and it had happened underground.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest takeaways from the book for me, just besides obviously the mysteries, but the fact that even today's technology can't solve, works from at least, a few hundred years ago. And to me, it kind of sums up that we underestimate those who came before us a lot. Do you agree with that?
I do, and the brilliance of the design of the thing is, to me, one of the most compelling clues is to, that we have about Oak Island, because someone who was truly brilliant must have designed it. I mean, that was at the time when I was there hanging out with Dan. He said at some point, well, whoever did this was the smartest SOB in the history of the world. And I started thinking, well, all right, well, who would qualify as the smartest SOB in the history of the world, which led me to at least consider a theory that I just dismissed as ridiculous when I first heard it, which was that the followers of Francis Bacon had done this. And but of all the seemingly preposterous theories I ever looked at, that was the one that had the most evidentiary support. I mean, there were just so many things that connected to it that not that I'm saying I believe it, but I certainly don't dismiss it.
I want to put that one just on ice for a little bit, and I want to talk about the theories a little bit later on. I want to cover my bases here for the unfamiliar.
Sure.
Just sticking with Dan Blankenship, he also made, I think his other major discovery, at least in my opinion, was he found, or appears to be, that he found the origin or a location where the flood system on the south side, where it was the 4 holes in the shore. You might talk about that story?
Part of all of the efforts to cut off the flood system from Smith's Cove had failed. People actually, found, what they called, thought was the flood tunnel at the time. And even when they dynamited that or blocked it, the system continued to flood. People were perplexed. Then in the, I think it was the late 70s, it got so cold up there in Nova Scotia that Mahone Bay froze solid. But Dan, who was still on the island, was running a pump in, I think it was 10X, not the money pit. Or it may have been the money pit. But yeah, it was the money pit, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And so, which created, obviously, the churning of the waters, heated the water. And as a result, he saw these 3, 4 holes evenly spaced open in the ice. As soon as he stopped pumping, the holes began to cover over again with ice. Then he would pump again, and the ice would melt. So there was clearly a connection. The water was flowing, and this was, a fair distance offshore. But if you put it in a long view, it had even at the time the young men discovered the money pit, there was about 30 feet more of shoreline all around Oak Island. The sea has risen that much. It may have been 50 feet when those work was done. So the original work was done. So it's quite possible that a lot of the tunneling that they did that was above ground, or at least maybe right at the tide line, is now covered over by the sea. And I think Dan proved that there are certainly 4 tunnels out there that lead to the money pit that are connected to the South Shore.
Do you think, just kind of wild theory here, that Dan wasn't able to find that until it was winter? Do you think seasons have anything to do with solving it, or really just because of the erosion of the beach?
Well, I mean, it's the erosion of the beach that the reason that those are probably underwater. I mean, because I'm assuming they didn't dig it from underwater back then. It might have been at the tide line. But my own belief, which it doesn't seem to be widely shared by the people running the search now, is that they should be looking first and foremost for whatever that access is that is now underwater, that is just offshore, maybe within 20 or 30 feet of the shore. Even though Oak Island is not immense, it's still, it's a very uneven, mile-long sort of island. And so, I mean, there's obviously a lot of shoreline to explore. And it's really murky because the beds of kelp that grow right along the shore of the island just clog vision. Make it nearly impenetrable. I mean, I've kayaked around there, and just getting through the kelp is the biggest challenge. So, I know it would be a difficult job to do. Dan himself at one point tried to convince his investors to pour tens of thousands of tons of concrete into those 4 holes out offshore that he'd found. But they wouldn't spend the money, I suppose from their point of view, reasonably. It would have been hugely expensive, and also they thought, well, there's no guarantee that that's it, that those are the only 4 tunnels and that we're going to block the flooding. So it's never been done.
At the same time as Blankenship, we have Fred Nolan, the other big one in the 20th century. While he was making his own discoveries at the same time, he comes off as a bit of a jerk in the book, but really, I think he might be just a little bit different than everybody else. His different thinking really led to some big discoveries. Share some of his important findings.
Well, I mean, Fred was a surveyor, so he approached it that way. He knew that the island, and he was right about that the island had these significant features that someone had created on the island, mostly with stones. I mean, much earlier than before Fred ever came along, someone had found what was called the stone triangle, which was basically a triangle of stones, sort of actually a sexton's shaped grouping of stones that pointed toward the money pit, especially if you looked at it through the other searchers in the 1930s, a man named Gilbert Hedden, who is an important figure also. He and his people found these drilled stones that were lined up in a way that if you looked straight through them and then through the stone triangle, you were right in the center of the money pit. So somebody had gone to all that trouble to leave basically a way to find the money pit if it was lost or, whatever would happen with the weather or the landscape. So it was just people were doing things, along with the artificial beach and all of that. So Fred was convinced that there were other features, and he began to make, many, many connections between, basically any carved stones or stones that looked as if they'd been cut, which led to what he and others consider his great discovery, which is these 3 enormous stones, the cone stones, as they're known, because they've been carved. They are cone-shaped. I mean, I was never convinced that they were not, just naturally shaped until finally the people doing the show got some geologists and stone carvers themselves to look at. They basically raised the stones, looked at the bottom, and saw that they were so smooth that that could never happen naturally, that they had been dragged into place. So somebody dragged these 10-ton stones into the shape of a cross, and it's perfectly geometrical cross that is spread out over hundreds of yards of thousands of yards of Oak Island. It's one more fascinating curiosity of the place. I mean, again, it would have taken a huge amount of labor, and there had to be a reason, but there's endless speculation on what that reason is. But Fred also made, with the help of a collaborator, made a really convincing case, not one that convinced me completely, or even mainly, but it was very convincing that what was buried there was the treasure that had been seized from Havana by the British in the mid 18th century. And there is of all the theories out there, that's one of the 3 or 4 that has the most documentary evidence to back it up.
Well, spoiler alert, I guess, but let's tell us about that.
There was a gigantic fortune in gold, silver, and precious stones seized from Havana. I mean, it was not just the Spanish treasure, but the Catholic Church was basically storing all the treasure that had been given to it in Havana too. So, decades of what the conquistadors had, amassed were stored in Havana, and it disappeared after the siege. But what the people running the siege actually reported and took back to the British Crown was a fraction of that. So that alone is suspicious. There are things about the chain of command that suggest there were, a lot of people involved in whatever happened, that add to the suspicion. There's records that a bunch of sailors who the British Navy actually sent a ship from Havana to Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and that the sailors who were there spent money, like drunken sailors. I mean, they spent a fortune on whiskey and women, and far more than British sailors could ordinarily spend. And so if the sailors themselves, if their piece of it was enough to spend like that, what must the leaders have taken away? And it's conceivable that they wanted to create, a place to cache this that could never be discovered. So, I mean, it's plausible. There is a fair bit of evidence that suggests it could have happened. I've never been convinced, because I've never been convinced that anyone would do something like what was done on Oak Island just to conceal a treasure of gold or silver, or that it had to be for some, bigger purpose. But of all the, gold and silver theories I've ever heard, that's the one I find most convincing.
Keeping with Nolan, in the book, you mentioned that he, like you said, he was a surveyor. He knows pretty much every inch of the island, and he even drew his own map. But that seemed to have been lost in time. Was that ever found?
Well, I mean, it's in the possession of his son, who inherited all of Fred's stuff. I mean, Fred was very cagey with all this stuff. I certainly didn't want to make him sound, like he was, some kind of a villain, because he wasn't. But
no,
he was
definitely not.
He was definitely an eccentric character, and very, very stingy about sharing, his information. But, he'd been conditioned that by, the years of being treated like an outsider. I mean, he got his piece of Oak Island by what, the other owners considered, devious means. It was actually pretty clever what he did, extremely clever, actually. But there was a lot of resentment and animosity, and to the point that, people were pointing guns at each other. But so Fred was up against that, and maybe felt that, he had to keep his own counsel, and he kept it all close to himself. And so what he really knew, which clearly was a lot about the island, it's possible that it died with him, or that it's in the records that his son has, and his son just hasn't, I think, been able to deal with his father's death enough to decide what to do with it all.
I often kept thinking that, wow, what could have Fred Nolan and Dan Blankenship accomplished if they worked together? Those two were working so hard together, but they both brought so much to the island and what's known about it. I just kept thinking about, wow, if only they worked together, even just for a little bit.
Yeah.
But I guess, that's kind of a microcosm of humanity, but I guess I digress a little bit. Let's just digress into a quick commercial. We'll explore more of the history of Oak Island and give our own theories about it. We'll be right back with Randall Sullivan on Z Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio. We're back on The Mind's Eye with journalist Randall Sullivan. We're discussing his enthralling new book, The Curse of Oak Island, the story of the world's longest treasure hunt. And Randall, I'm going to give you the keys to the Oak Island in the sense that if you were to lead an excavation, what would you do in a little bit? But I just want to cover our bases. Let's get ourselves into the 21st century, the present day, and talk about kind of what's going on right now. But I was just wondering, with the brothers, the Legina brothers?
Yes.
Do they own the land where the money pit is? Or is that owned by, who's that owned by? Or just really? Well,
that's owned in part by them and Dan Blankenship. I mean, they bought out basically Triton. Really, yes. The answer is yes. They own that land. Dan Blankenship has a stake in it that is because he had a piece of Triton and a piece of the company that controlled the money pit, which was called Oak Island Tours. So the Leginas bought out his partner, and but they have central control. They have the greater control of the island and the money pit.
I just thought it'd be a cruel twist of fate for just if it was really an elaborate hoax, that maybe it was just, it might be great long-term financial profitability by just leasing the rights to people and it was never anything. But, another one of my wild theories there. But obviously not. Clearly not.
Well, that was one of the things that, proved to me that it was never a hoax. This hoax idea was, to me, ridiculous, because the only way that those young men in the beginning could have profited was either by selling the land or leasing the land to searchers. I mean, you tell me, is there any other way they could have made money off it? And that's not what they chose to do. Every search company that approached them, the deal they made was for a piece of whatever was found. They didn't try to get money up front. They didn't try to sell the land. They wanted a piece of whatever was down there. So, and that happened over and over. And so clearly they weren't scamming. They weren't trying to get anything but whatever they believed was down there.
All right. And right now, who's searching for what's down there is the Legina brothers. They're doing the present day excavations. Tell us about some of the discoveries that they've found over the years.
Well, they found a lot, especially recently.
The most prominent.
To me, the discoveries they made during the summer of 2017 were really remarkable. I mean, I suppose the most shocking was the discovery of human skeletons like 180 feet below ground. And there's always been stories of people who did the original works. Obviously, some of them must have died in cave-ins or whatever along the way, and so recovering what is certainly the remains of two different human beings at that depth was, a compelling discovery, I think. But also, they and a lot of other people have and it had really emphasized, and the show itself has emphasized, the theory that it was the Knights Templar who did this in order to conceal some great religious artifact like the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail or something like that. And I've been pretty dismissive of that theory, just because there's a lot of what's used as supposed historical evidence is really just pseudo historical evidence. It's pretty easily debunked. But in 2017, the guy who does the main metal detecting on the island, Gary Drayton, found this metal cross, hand-wrought metal cross that antiquities experts have identified as something that dates back to about the 13th century. And it's basically a cross that's kind of created out of a human form. The cross, it's the limbs and arms of a human being making the cross. But the image is an exact match for something that was drawn on the wall at Dom prison in France, where the Templars were held shortly before their execution back in the 13th century. So how this cross got on Oak Island, buried just under some rocks, is a mystery that I can't answer, but it also was a discovery that made me back off a little bit from my dismissal of the whole Templar theory, because it's one more inexplicable finding on the island.
And it seems like you can do that with almost every theory. Obviously, some of the real crazy ones not, but a large portion of them seems like, I don't know. But then there's just that one little piece of evidence where you're like, it might be actually. I don't know. It seems like that's a kind of a running theme through some of these explanations.
Yeah. I mean, it's both one of the most frustrating, it is the most frustrating, but also fascinating parts of working on this book was that it's very difficult to dismiss any of these theories, or many of these theories, no matter how outlandish they seem at first blush. There are some I was able to dismiss. It definitely is not the French crown jewels. So, and anyone I could find that I could actually know it's not that and put a, fork in it was gave me a great feeling of satisfaction, because there were so many that I had to say, well, I don't believe it, and there's not a lot of evidence, but, it's not implausible, and there is this and there's that, and so maybe. And you end up, sort of taking that I doubt it, but I don't dismiss it, attitude toward the majority of the theories that people put forward.
I want to give you the keys to the castle. Let's say you had the Legina brothers' money. What would you do to try and solve it?
Well, the first thing I do, and I suggested to both of the brothers, is do a really thorough underwater survey of the shore of the island, maybe from 40 feet from the low tide line, and basically just scour the whole thing, looking for what could be a man-made cave or tunnel. Dan Blankenship told me that he found something like that way back in the 60s and he didn't make much of it, and the location's been lost, although he knows the approximate area. And I thought, well, that's what we should do. We should go back and try to, locate that spot, look at what it was, and see if it leads. Because the people who did the work and who planned to go back and retrieve whatever was there, perhaps did go back and retrieve whatever was there. I'm assuming they had some sort of a, entry, basically a walk-in tunnel, or at least a crawl-in tunnel, that allowed them to get access to whatever was cached up there. And so that's what I would do first. I do a number of other things just to satisfy my curiosity more than think that it would necessarily solve the mystery. But that would be my big project if I was running the show.
What are some of the other things that you would hit?
Well, something I'd really like to see done, and Marty Legane and I talked about this, and he said he thought it should be done, would be to do what he called a magnetic survey, because there is some inexplicable energy on Oak Island that causes equipment failure on a level and with a frequency that is just, confounding. Equipment that has worked everywhere in the world is brought to Oak Island and fails. Just talking even to the technicians who work on the show, they're all just sort of flabbergasted by how often, the equipment that has been very reliable, especially the people like do sound and things, that it goes out, it fails, they lose it. And the people who work on the show, every time something goes wrong, they just look at each other, shrug, and say, Oak Island. But there's something about that, because it's happened again and again and again, and there's a fair amount of solid evidence about that, about equipment going out and failing. And so there's some. I think both of the Leganes agree there is some kind of energy on the island in certain spots created by I don't know what that has this effect. So trying to trace that, locate it, identify it, figure out what its source is would be fascinating to me.
And just sticking with curse for a little bit, and that kind of is a threefold type thing. One you were just talking about with things just weird happening, and then there's the paranormal part of it, which you seem to embrace in the book, which I appreciated it. You included stories, ghost stories, witches, apparitions, and even a few stories. A couple of them were really eerie. The one with the possession of Dan Henske and the Becky Parsons ghost stories, and just of those the Jim Kaiser story, actually, that really got to me too. Yeah, well, I was going to say of those tales. Yeah, tell about that one. That one seems to be the most chilling for you. Well, what is it?
Yeah, it did. I think because the impact on his family was just so visceral. But he was a Mi'kmaq Indian who was working on the island in the 60s when Oak Island had its the single greatest tragedy in history, which was 4 people dying in one day, and it was poison gas that killed them down in this. They were down in a shaft, and no one wanted to go down to retrieve the bodies, so they were just going to basically use a big gaff and a meat hook to pull the bodies out. And Jim had been working with these people, said we can't do that to them, and so he rigged up an old World War II gas mask and wrapped it and taped it and soaked it in water and had him lower him down and he brought back one body at a time. He did that 4 times, brought the 4 bodies up. He was, it was heroic what he did. And then, and afterward, the guy who now had control of the island after these deaths hired him to work as a night watchman. So he was staying in this little shack where the Randalls, which is the family that had been basically running the search, had lived. And he came home in the middle of the night one night shaking, and this was like everyone who knew him said, he never showed fear about anything. He was just completely stoic, but he came home shaking and trembling and telling his wife, "I'll never go back on that island again." And he wouldn't talk for a long time about what it was, but he finally told the story that he was, laying on a cot in the because he was spending the night on the island, laying in a cot in the shed, and some figure appeared, some black, hairy figure, large black, hairy figure appeared, loomed over him and then pinned him down, holding his arms, and told him, "Don't ever come back here again." And Jim never did go back on the island again, and none of his family members has ever gone. It made that much of an impression. But he eventually killed himself. His family ascribes, the fact that he was so, frightened and humiliated by being frightened as part of it, and that may or may not be. But I was talking to his grandson, and he said that he finally asked his grandmother, Jim's wife, about the story, and do you believe it? And she said, "Well, all I know is when he came home that night, he had bruises on his arms that were in the shape of hands, fingers, and palms." So, it made it, and that made, a deep impression on Tim, who has never gone on the island himself, even though he lives right there, Tim being the grandson.
On a personal side, Randall, do you believe in things like that, demons and ghosts? Where do you fall?
I do believe that there is a supernatural reality. I don't speak with any authority on it, and I yield to greater knowledge. But yes, I do think that there is an invisible world of consciousness that is around us.
And you published a book a few years ago called The Miracle Detective, and you claim to have your own miracle while doing an investigation for the book.
Yeah, I don't know how if it's germane to the people listening to this, because it really happened in a Christian, in fact, a Catholic context. And I say that as someone at the time who was not Catholic or Christian. I was actually in Bosnia as a war correspondent at the time, but I was in this village called Medjugorje, which is the location of what has probably been the most closely watched and attended alleged apparition of the Virgin Mary since Fatima. And millions of people from all over the world have come there to meet with these young women who claim to be having these visions. And as fate had it, I ended up actually staying in the home of one of those young women, actually the one who was sort of the most central figure among them. The only one of them was actually educated and not really from the village. She grew up in Sarajevo. But anyway, we were having I don't know if I would call it an interview, more like a debate. When I'd just been there a few days, and she asked me, "Well, have you ever gone to the mountain where these, the mountain of the cross? There's this giant cross built on this mountain back in the 1930s, and there's a whole story associated with this." And I said, "Well, no, I haven't yet, but I've been." And she screamed at me, "Well, then you should just go. Get out of here. If you're not willing to even go look at the mountain, how can we talk about this?" And so I sort of, I don't know if I was thrown out or I threw myself out, but anyway, I stormed out. It was like a blistering hot day, and I was wearing nothing but shorts and a tank top with hiking boots, and I just started walking. I wasn't even conscious. I was walking in the direction of the mountain, and But when I got there, I decided, well, I'll just climb it. I'm fine. It's time. I was going to do it anyway. So I started to climb, and it was because it was so hot that day. There was nobody out, nobody on the mountain. I got, and it's laid out in with stations of the cross. There are 12 stations of the cross with monuments, and at each station. I think I was at about the third station when suddenly the sky just began to turn dark, and with this kind of speed, the suddenness of it was breathtaking, and it was just this knot of clouds that was directly over the mountain, directly over me, and it unleashed the most, a thunder and lightning storm like nothing I've ever experienced, and there were actually, lightning was actually hitting the ground, close enough that I could see it, and I suddenly had this overwhelming sense that, shit, it's all true, and now, I'm going to be struck dead for being such an unbeliever, but I decided to just keep going up the mountain, and by then it was really cold, and rain was pouring, and I was soaking wet, and I was scared by what was happening, because it seemed so personal, because I could look out and there was sun all around me. This was just right over the mountain, this just little knot of black clouds, and then I started to hear singing, and in French, and French being my the best of my foreign languages, I could recognize some of it, and I went in that direction, and there was this group of nuns kneeling in front of a cross at, I think it was the fourth or fifth station of the cross. And I just was so comforted by their presence that I knelt with them just to have company. And I just continued up the mountain that way. When they'd stop to kneel and pray, I'd stop and kneel and pray. And, I'd never done any kneeling and praying before that. So then we finally got to the top, and I was really, in some sort of altered, conversion kind of a state, I guess. And I was kneeling, and I was shivering in the rain, and suddenly this young woman walked up to me and put a cloth over my shoulders and a hat on my head, and I just sort of looked at her, and I don't even think I was capable of saying thank you, and so I closed my eyes and tried to pray, and when I opened them, the clouds were evaporating, the storm was over. And the storm was already over, and the clouds were melting away. The sun was coming out, and there was nobody there. No nuns, no young woman, nobody. So I was, I thought, well, it seemed like it was just minutes. So I literally ran down the mountain trying to catch up with them. And there's only one way up or down. And there was nobody. And then I climbed back up the mountain thinking, could they be off to the side? Could they be anywhere? And I couldn't find them. I went down to the bottom. There's a little cafe at the bottom. I said, have you seen a group of nuns come down here? And no, we've not seen anything like that. There's been anybody. You've been the only one. So, I put the hat and the cloth on a rock there. I didn't know what else to do with it. And walked back into town where everybody was talking about this incredible storm. They'd never seen anything like it. So I was like, well, at least I know that was real. I didn't imagine that. And then finally, told some people that while I was on the mountain when that happened, and I was very reluctant to share the story of what had happened to me, what I'd experienced, but it's internally, it had a huge impact on me.
And you became religious after that point, or that didn't come out?
I did. No. I mean, I experienced, an immediate conversion. Really, I mean, I became very, very Catholic while I was in Bosnia. I mean, to the point that I would go to they had 2 masses a day, and I would go to both of them. I was that affected by it, and I carried it over when I got home. And when I got back to the United States, people who knew me just thought, you're not even the same person. And a lot of them weren't happy about it. I mean, it seemed like I don't know whether they thought I was turning into a religious nut, or I just, but I seemed really different. I had no idea how I was going to fit back into Rolling Stone, where I'd already worked for, 15 years. But the force of it was so great that I held on to it. I mean, it waned over time. and waned to the point that by the time my son, who hadn't even been born when this happened, by the time he was in high school and he was asked to describe, his father's religious affiliation, he described me as loosely Christian. So I mean, it did. I can't say that I stayed in that same sort of devout place, but the experience itself and my conviction that there is something real and that, for some reason, God pointed his finger at me and said, pay attention. That has stayed with me.
And personally, on my side, I'm agnostic, and interviewing a variety of people, I hear a lot of these stories, and I constantly go back and forth on does something exist afterward, does or not. But when I hear people like you, journalists, people who have searched for the truth, clearly, intelligent people, those are the stories that kind of stick with me. And sometimes I think I'm 51%, 49%, and that 1% is probably because of stories, and events that have happened to people like you. So yeah,
I'm pleased to hear it.
Mm-hmm. All right, I guess we got to trail back to Oak Island at some point. Oh wait, no, before we do, I was wondering because this, the miracle that you were talking about and the investigation was for the book The Miracle Detective, and that spawned a TV show which you were hosting that was on Oprah Winfrey Network. Did you ever get a chance to meet Oprah? What is she like in real life?
Well, yeah, I mean, Oprah interviewed me on her show back when she had a real show. She was different off camera than on, which isn't to say that I think she's fake. It's just that, she was warmer. With me, she was, warm and friendly off camera in a way, and on camera was really, interrogating me about, what had really happened, should she believe it? And it was, she's a large figure who knows her power. But I have to say that, for me, I was probably different. I'm usually not, at all intimidated by celebrity. But in this case, she was not only Oprah, she was my boss. Because I was doing the show for her new network. So I think the combination of that did have me a little bit, on my heels.
I think talking to Oprah will have anybody on their heels, quite frankly, no matter if you work for her or not, just being in her presence. Yeah, she's a larger-than-life character, like a lot of the people in the book, The Curse of Oak Island. All right, let's stop delaying the inevitable and just talk about some of the theories that, explain what's down there. And there's way too many to touch on, so there's no way we're going to talk about all of them. Let's just talk on some of the big ones. Let's just transition from the paranormal part, because one thing that you wrote about the story that freaked me out that deals with what's possibly down there is that, you said that the money pit might not have been designed to keep men out, but to keep something in. Clarify that statement a little bit, because that sent chills down my bone.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, it was a wild thought, that I had the first time. When I was on Oak Island the first time, it was cold, it was wet, it was foggy. There was, only Dan and his wife were on the island, and so when I would go to the money pit area alone, I mean, it felt eerie, very, very eerie, and the whole place felt eerie to me. But as I was standing there, I just had this, wild thought that, well, maybe it's not, maybe they didn't do this to, bury a treasure. Maybe they did it to keep something scary shut down there. But it was right after that I met Dan Hinsky, who had done a huge amount of the excavation on Oak Island. He was basically worked side by side with Dan Blankenship for years, and he'd had a nervous breakdown that culminated. I mean, its culmination was him standing exactly where I had by the money pit and becoming convinced that it was the entrance to hell, and all of hell's demons were about to pour out into the world. And it's sent him into a shock so deep he had to be institutionalized for a while. I mean, Dan's a very sensitive person, and but him sharing that story and combined with that wild thought, I guess, that I had myself that day, that's why I even mentioned it in the book, because it's not something I probably have been comfortable admitting that I thought.
And luckily that hasn't happened yet. It hasn't opened up to the gates of hell. But, kind of like all the other theories and, talking about the paranormal stuff, you can't exactly rule it out. Although I'll say probably not, but you can't exactly rule it out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm certainly not, trying to sound as if I'm advocating for that. I'm just saying that, the Oak Island is an eerie, scary place. And even like Marty Lagina, who's as solid, as pragmatic, as much of a gearhead as you could be in a lot of ways, but he was telling me about the first time he was ever, in the Money Pit area after dark by himself. He heard this like piercing scream that didn't sound human, and it scared the bejesus out of him. And he fled immediately, and he's never gone back there at night alone since.
Yeah, that's got to say something. But let's try and, I guess, solve this with some plausible explanations. And I think your opinion is very important, because you don't really have a dog in the fight. If the treasure is found, your bank account probably is not going to see that much of a difference. Maybe a marginal increase, but probably not that much of a difference. So I think your opinion, and particularly obviously because of all the research that you've done too, but most people think that it's gold, some type of monetary treasure, but you hinted at in the book that you don't think it is. What do you think is down there?
Well, one, I don't know what's down there. First and foremost, I have to say that, and it's merely which of the theories I've heard resonates or has the greatest plausibility, and I don't dismiss that it's gold or silver or treasure. I mean, the two theories about that have been most persuasive were the treasure of Havana, or that conquistadors actually did those work, had Incan slaves do that work, and were hiding gold from the Spanish king at the time. And I don't dismiss those. I mean, they're both plausible, but I've always felt that how would you motivate people to do this kind of something like this? Or why would people want to do something like this just to conceal gold or treasure? I mean, it would just be easier to hide than that. Again, like it says, they were using slaves, so it wasn't like they were doing the work. Maybe he's right, but I've just always felt it had to be something more. And then certainly, the Knights Templar theory is the most thrilling, exciting theory that anyone has put forth. I mean, what could be greater than the Ark of the Covenant is buried down there, or the Holy Grail? I don't subscribe to that, because there's just too much historical evidence that undermines it. A theory that I really dismissed outright when I first heard it involved Francis Bacon, because generally it was connected to was espoused by these people who think that Bacon really wrote the Shakespeare plays, and that those manuscripts were buried down there. And I don't think Bacon wrote the Shakespeare plays, and I don't think those manuscripts are buried down there. But when I began to look at who Bacon was and who his followers were and what a significant figure he was, I realized that he was a figure who inspired this sort of Christ-like devotion among a lot of great people. There were the circle of people who were gathered around him at Gray's Inn in Elizabethan England were, they were the greatest minds themselves of the time, the greatest surgeon of the time, the greatest chemist of the time, the greatest architect of the time. All of these people were gathered around him and looked up to him, and there were one of his, I guess you'd say, proteges or followers, but a close one. Was a really well-known engineer. In fact, what he was known for was recovering precious metals or coal or whatever it was, whatever they were from flooded tunnels. He knew how to control flood systems, and he left journals about how close he was to Bacon, and Bacon was sharing with him this esoteric knowledge, including his greatest secret and things like that. So they were in this, his name's Thomas Bushell, in his journals. And right after Bacon died, he disappeared, and the story was that he was off on a religious retreat, but no one knows for sure. But those years correspond to, the years that make the most sense for when the works on Oak Island happened. So it's that, along with then the people who are real Baconites, which are really, they're like a religious order. Some of them have used his star maps, basically, his astronomical calculations to say that they point to a single place on the planet, and that place is this little dot of land off the coast of Nova Scotia that is Oak Island. Yeah, I could go on. There are, any number of other things that kind of made the theory something I was less and less inclined to dismiss. But when I read some of Bacon's works, and he has his Silva Silvarum, which is his, sort of really just kind of an account of the various, scientific projects he's proposing or that he's accomplished. And there was one about how to create a perpetual spring. And the very first sentences were, dig a pit upon the seashore. So, which is what the money pit is. And there was something in his writings about how this whole idea of creating using a treasure hunt as a way to teach people to look for deeper treasure, something more profound. And I kept those words from Dan Blankenship kept echoing. Whoever did this was the smartest SOB in the history of the world. Well, Bacon might have been. Thomas Jefferson called him one of the three greatest men who ever lived. He basically was the founder of the modern scientific method. And not only that, but he was actually the foundation of English and now American jurisprudence. All of that is based on his works. He really was an extraordinary man, and the people around him were, extraordinary as well. Samuel D. John D. He was the most. I was vaguely aware of who John D. was, but when I started to read his history, I was just amazed and enthralled, really. And Isaac Newton, who was, part of this also. Isaac Newton, unbeknownst to me, Isaac Newton wrote many, many, many more pages about alchemy than he ever did about physics.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character, but that's a whole nother story. Now, what I've kind of gathered from so many theories that have been put out there is that it seems like everyone's explanation is almost like a Rorschach. Your biases just really bleed through. For example, and I'll admit I'm one of those people. I am a Freemason myself, so I think it appears to be Masonic in nature to me. And I'm usually good at separating the two, but in this case, there seems to be a lot of good evidence. The rock with the letter G, which has a lot of significance for the Brotherhood. The underground survey that talked about the 100,000 man hours that would go into making this happen, and that's a big Masonic thing. So I think it was designed and built by Masons. To me,
I don't dispute it. All the triangles. There are many triangles that are built into this, whatever it was, so I don't dispute it. I just, and part of what made, say, the Bacon theory compelling is that, he was sort of, almost a forerunner of the emergence of Freemasonry, which there's a lot of historical connections between the Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, and in some, you can find Bacon sort of at that. At the intersecting point of Rosicrucianism landing in Elizabethan England and the gradual emergence of Freemasonry.
Now, a bunch of old coins have been found throughout the island. Do you think that's just because of the human activity, or that actually might be indicative of treasure?
Well, I mean, I'd have to say first, I don't know. I mean, I'm more inclined toward the former, that because there were, except why would 16th century Spanish coins be on the island? But it was a world, back in those days where sailors, pirates, whoever. I mean, they used coins. They could use Spanish coins, French coins, English coins. They weren't particular about that, and then they easily could have just been dropped by people who were on the island, doing whatever they were doing. But some of them seem too old to have come after the discovery on Oak Island. That they must have been left there by someone who was there before the discovery of the money pit. So that among many other things makes you think that, well, there was somebody here and they dropped some coin out of a bag, or a button came off a shirt, or whatever it was, but they were here doing something. So, way back in the 1600s or early 1700s.
Yeah, we could talk about
maybe.
No, please. What you were saying? Maybe what?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people who think it could have happened even before that. And I don't know. I mean, but the money pit itself, I feel fairly confident after reading through the early accounts that it probably couldn't have happened any time before about the early 1600s.
And we could talk about the theories all night long, but I only have you here for a few more minutes. So I just want to talk about the future and then just backtrack to the past a little bit. With the Lagina brothers, you're up close and personal to what they're doing. What do they have planned for the future to solve this?
Well, I mean, they were only willing to talk to me about what they were doing last summer. I was there in September, and they showed me what they had done, and some of which no doubt has already been on the show. But I had to sign non-disclosure agreements that I would never talk about it until the entire season of these shows stopped running. So I could, I'm limited in what I can say, in other words. But what they did do was build many times people have tried to build a dam to hold back the ocean, to try to explore that land along the south shore that was probably not underwater, back when whatever was done on Oak Island was done. And they are the first ones who succeeded at actually building a dam that holds back the ocean and has allowed them to excavate there. They were doing that when I was there, and and they were finding some things that I don't think I'm free to say what those things are, but until I know for certain. That's all been on the show. But so they were doing that, and they're going to try obviously different technologies to explore what is in the money pit area. I mean, there's all kinds of but the fact is that every bit of everything they've tried, the sonar, there's certainly ground penetrating instruments that can give you a sense of what's down there, but it's such a jumble that I don't think still anyone knows for sure that this isn't the artifact of treasure hunters, not of the original works. And so sorting all that out, trying to separate the incredible mess that's been made by centuries of exploration on Oak Island from what was initially done there, I think is a big task. I don't know. I mean, I when I was back, I repeated again my suggestion that they should explore offshore, and they both nodded like they thought that made sense, but I don't know if that's where they'll go.
Yeah, I hope so, because it seems to make a lot of sense to direct it towards there. With the advancement in technology that we have, and that's going to be happening, do you think it's going to be solved in our lifetime?
Boy, honestly, heart of heart, well, not in my lifetime, but then, but then I'm not in my 20s anymore. But I don't know. I mean, technology is certainly advancing, but I mean, I've seen Oak Island defeat, and they've certainly made some interesting discoveries, and they found, remarkable things, but I don't think they've really, made a true breakthrough discovery, unless there was something this last summer that, because they were hinting at, but they didn't want to tell me. We'll find out in the last episode of this season what it was, because that's how they always do it. But the Oak Island is now such a mess, like I said before, from the, dozens upon dozens of failed attempts to try to get down there, and which has just made, it's just a jumble of collapsed tunnels and pits, and the money pit itself collapsed in 1861 and took down 10,000 board feet of timber that's down there, that is not the original work. So it's getting down through all that and sorting it out. I just met some guy who was, part of military special forces. Say, we have a good piece of equipment that would, we could figure that out in a day. They could figure that out in a day if they really wanted to. But I've seen people make those claims and bring their equipment to Oak Island and not get very far. So, I'm skeptical about that.
And this was 2 decades in the making, and fantastic research. I know it just came out, but do you have an eye for the future, for what's coming up next for you, or just going to take a break?
Well, I have one of my books, Labyrinth, which I wrote in the early 21st century, was recently made into a film that starring Johnny Depp and Forrest Whitaker, that's going to come out, I hope, in May or June, because that's when the sequel to Labyrinth that I've written will be coming out, and so that's on its way. And I have 600 pages of another book written, and 2 or 3 others in various stages of conception.
We've touched on Biggie and Tupac before on this podcast, and maybe when that book comes out, we'll circle back and get you on and talk about that for a little bit.
That'd be great.
Randall, it really has been a true pleasure talking to you and about the curse of Oak Island, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Big digital clap for Randall Sullivan. We'll be right back with the Mind's Eye wrap-up. You know what that means? It's time for the Mind's Eye wrap-up. And when it comes to Oak Island, Marty Lagina said it best when the only thing that really matters is what we can find, see with our own eyes, and hold in our hands. There's been a lot of discoveries over the past, 230 years on the island, but there's still way more questions than answers. We'll be paying attention to the stories and the excavations, and we'll let you know if they find any gold. Like us here at the Mind's Eye, with our listeners who are the true treasures in our lives, especially if they join us next week when we have another phenomenal guest, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Edward Humes. He's going to be talking about his new book, Burned, A Story of Murder and the Crime That Wasn't. It's about Joanne Parks and the house fire that claimed the lives of her 3 small children on an April night in 1989. It's also a pretty disturbing look at junk science and the justice system. Join us for that one. Until we meet again, be well and let well be. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for the Mind's Eye on Stitcher and Z Talk Radio.